All right, good evening, everybody. Glad to see you here. This is the Harris School's third event that we're doing, trying to think through some analysis of how we should think about policy in the now new Trump administration. We had an event last quarter with Professor Casey Mulligan from the economics department, who's now joining the administration in a Senate-appointed position to help us think through economic and regulatory policy. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I can't quite remember, some of my colleagues were here doing an event on domestic policy, exploring education policy and tax policy, redistribution, and energy and environmental policy. And today we are thrilled to do a panel on thinking about foreign policy in the new administration. So I should say, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ethan Brenner-Mesquita. I'm the Dean of the Harris School, and I'm joined by three esteemed colleagues, Professors Austin Wright and Konstantin Sonin from the Harris School, and Professor Paul Poast from the Political Science Department. It's great to have them with us, and I'm excited to get going. So we're going to do some conversation, and then we will open it up to Q&A, and away we go. So I'm going to start with a kind of a little bit of a broad question that'll give you all a little bit of a chance to pontificate on how you are thinking about foreign policy in the next 4 years, but maybe is unfairly broad. So one way I thought about phrasing this is just, is there a Trump doctrine? We're in the second Trump administration, so we've already had a chance to see some foreign policy out of President Trump. So how does Donald Trump think about, or his administration think about, foreign policy? What are their foreign policy goals, if we can articulate them? And how should we just think about their foreign policy agenda looking forward over the next 4 years? So Paul, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So thank you for having me here. Thank you all for coming tonight for this important conversation. And I'm glad to be here with my colleagues to hopefully have an informative conversation. And I think that's where I want to start, is what do we mean by a Trump doctrine? And one thing I like to say about Trump is, some people say that Trump, he's hard to nail down, it's hard to know what he says. And I say, actually, he's quite predictable. He's predictably unpredictable, right? You never really know exactly where he stands on things. He's notorious for doing the last thing that he heard. So if you can be the last person in the room and tell him something, then that's likely going to be the policy. At least those were kind of the stereotypes that came out of his first administration. And so that would be maybe one unifying idea I think about with Trump. But actually recently looking at, and especially listening to what he's been saying on the campaign trail, I think there's another way to really think about Trump, at least from my perspective, and that is that Trump is going to be an outstanding 19th century president. And what I mean by that is, if you actually listen to what he's been saying, most notably his admiration for William McKinley. I don't know what he did. I don't know if he read a book about McKinley during the past 4 years or something.
Maybe a movie.
Maybe a movie about McKinley. I mean, he's also renamed Mount McKinley.
TikTok
video. Who knows what it is, but he is very fascinated by William McKinley. So much so he mentioned numerous times on the campaign trail. Now, a lot of times he would refer to McKinley in the context of talking about tariffs, which is something I'm sure we can talk quite a bit about tonight, is his tariff policy, and talking about how we had all these great high tariffs back in the 1890s, and that's a great way to fund our government, and they do all sorts of great things, and I love them. And you talk about in that context, but also to think about McKinley, or to think about 19th century presidents, we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about acquiring new possessions. This was, of course, McKinley was president during the Spanish-American War, where then suddenly we had control of Puerto Rico, the Philippines after defeating them. And what have we heard Trump talking about? Panama, Greenland. So we're seeing that. Also, McKinley ran as president. Probably one of the most famous things that people know of, even if they don't know McKinley, they know of who he ran against in 1896, which was William Jennings Bryan. And that was when William Jennings Bryan, just down the street in downtown Chicago, gave his famous Cross of Gold speech. And the reason why was because McKinley ran on the United States is going to be on the gold standard. That's what we're going to do. Even his campaign posters said, civilization, prestige, prosperous. That was how it was going to be. Trump, of course, is not talking about putting us back on the gold standard, unless I'm missing something. But he is talking about creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve and to underpin the dollar. And he's talked a lot about the status of the dollar and needing in that nature. So for me, I think that that's one way I could think about a Trump doctrine, or to think about a unified theory of Trump's foreign policy, is to say that he could be a very good 19th century president for the United States.
Okay, my area of expertise today is Ukraine and Russia. And here I think Trump's goals is very simple. I think he's set to get a Nobel Peace Prize because he's competing, among other things, he's like in an eternal race with Barack Obama. And one thing to beat Barack Obama is to get a Nobel Prize for himself. And I think like looking at the world, he sees that this is like the direct route is to have a peace in the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia-Ukraine war, I don't know, like it made a lot of headlines 3 years ago, but actually this year there were far more people killed than in the previous 2 years. So this is a huge conflict. This is perhaps, it might be that this is the largest interstate war since World War II, and this is certainly the largest European war in decades. But so it's a big thing if there is a way to stop the war. Of course, there is a sort of a paradox because I think that there are some things that we know about Donald Trump. For example, his admiration of the cult of power in general, and I think that Putin as a 19th century strong man is also like as a Russian Tsar, he's more like of his soulmate, but I think that the desire to get the Nobel Peace Prize, it's far larger than any admiration to Putin, so he's set to stop this war. So the Trump doctrine, in my area of expertise, it's Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you were to sort of encapsulate the Trump doctrine, or at least what he is trying to propose as a doctrine, is America first, right? It's a transition to like very transparent transactional politics. So, you know, I think later on we're going to be having conversations about the recent executive orders about withdrawing from the World Health Organization, right? About withdrawing from the Paris Accords. And again, all of this is sort of grounded in the nature of America first. Why are we withdrawing from the Paris Accords? Because of concerns about the impact of those accords on American workers. Why are we withdrawing from the World Health Organization? At least like proposed concerns about the management of the pandemic, specifically how it affected the United States, right? And when we think about, you know, a lot of the changes that occurred during Trump 1 and likely will occur under Trump 2, it really is about putting sort of the United States position first in the global stage, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. is going to engage in state building. In fact, probably quite the opposite, right? We're going to see sort of retrenchment moving back, focusing on domestic politics. But I think, you know, of course, like, you know, Paul pointed out, there's a lot of unpredictability in what might potentially happen. And the last person in the room whispering about a policy option might end up being the one that's the most influential.
All right, so we'll come back to international organizations and the rule-based order and all of that, and try and unpack a little bit about America First thinking in a bit. I want to build on this idea of the retrenchment and pulling back, and also on this question of the war in Ukraine and whether Donald Trump's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I would think if he wanted to one-up Barack Obama, he would try and win the physics prize, but. So I think if you think about American foreign policy over the in the post-war period, there's lots to dislike and like and whatever, and there's many things we can debate. I think the kind of unquestioned triumph of American foreign policy, and maybe some other countries' foreign policy as well, over the last 80 years, is that we have not, in fact, seen a great power war. This has been a period of extraordinary peace, punctuated by small wars, and some of them terrible, but we have not seen catastrophic conflict in the way that had become quite commonplace, since the Napoleonic Wars, I guess. And I think that's interesting to think about. The Trump administration does talk about America first, but they also talk about peace through strength, which sounds like deterrence. And I think if we think about the long peace of the 20th century and the early 21st century, I tend to think at least deterrence had a big part in that. Nuclear weapons had a part in that. And so so I think there's an interesting set of questions about can a country which is dedicated to this that seems to be dedicated to this kind of America first retrenchment, are we putting ourselves in a position where exactly by doing that, we are setting ourselves up for the wars that we would like to avoid so that we can focus on the country itself? And one sort of further point on that I'd love to hear you guys talk about is sort of military preparedness. One way to be strong, to have peace through strength is military preparedness. And I think any objective analysis of where we stand now is the kind of doctrine for the last 10 or 20 years has been to be ready for, kind of a one-front war. And even there, I think for the most plausible one-front wars, we haven't been doing much of a job of, we've let, right, and the military-industrial complex or whatever, we're building the wrong navy for defending Taiwan and et cetera, et cetera. I think when we look at the world today, it's entirely plausible if great power conflict comes, it's going to come in the form of a three-front war. And so does the America First agenda look like peace through strength? Does this administration have the stomach for massive investment in military technologies? I don't know. Where are we heading towards great power conflict again?
Yeah, I mean, I think Taiwan specifically, right? Some recent comments from Trump suggest that he's willing to sort of back off our overt security commitments to Taiwan, and of course, part of that is perhaps hedging against China's interests in Taiwan itself, right? So limiting the U.S. exposure. I mean, I find this to be tremendously problematic. One other feature here to think about is sort of post World War II, the United States invested tremendously in guns, right? So the U.S. invested tremendously in developing its military power and projecting that power globally. It did that in effectively a unipolar setting for much of the post-Cold War period. And what other actors have done, specifically China, they've made different kinds of investments. In fact, they've invested tremendously in economic resources. And so starting in sort of the early 2010s, under the new Maritime Silk Road Initiative, China began investing in acquisition of ports. So you all have heard about sort of Panama Canal is coming back up again, right? Like the U.S. for a period of time up until the very end of 1999 had control over the Panama Canal. That then got reverted to the control of Panama itself. Now there are two ports on either side of the canal, both of which are controlled by Hong Kong-based companies. Those two ports were acquired as part of the Maritime Silk Road Initiative and the broader Belt and Road Initiative program. Those two ports represent a very small subset of China's investment in acquiring ports globally. And now, China went from both directly and indirectly controlling about 5 to 7.5% of global trade in the early 2010s to now China controls, through its port acquisitions directly and indirectly, more than 75% of global trade. And so the threat that now poses, not just a military one, right? It poses a massive economic threat to the globe, right, in a sense. And so when we're thinking about sort of drawing back, we're thinking about backing off of, for example, Taiwan, that's also happening in a setting where China is not just making investments along the military front, they're also making them in an economic front, which itself represents a security risk.
I don't know whether the period of retrenchment is sort of unique, because I have always thought that the United States is sort of a unique great power for the history, at least for the last 200 years, which basically had like internal strength, internal movement forward towards retrenchment, meaning that most of the great powers, historically France, Germany, Russia, Japan, they basically grabbed whatever they were able to grab. So if Russian Empire has ever put troops somewhere, then the only reason to withdraw the troops was a military defeat or something. And the United States certainly did in the 20th century withdrawn troops from Philippines, despite a significant chunk of the population willing to expand the American empire, but it was not expanded. The same thing after World War II. Certainly, the United States could have occupied a huge chunk of the world and Europe, and it retrenched. And I have always thought that a huge investment in NATO and weapons industry and all these things, this was basically the main reason for this was sort of a fear to be involved in a new European war. So I understand that after like 5 decades, 6 decades without a European war, this fear started to subside, right? But I think that the second Trump administration, and it understands better than the first one that whenever the United States retrench from Europe, then there's such bad things are happening there, then it will have to reinvest there at a new and huge cost.
This is a question that I've given a lot of thought to, about basically asking myself, is Trump a potential cause of a great power war, or would he be a symptom of the factors that lead to a great power war? And that's really been the key thing I've been asking myself when thinking about this. So what would be Trump as a cause? Well, Trump as a cause would be the idea that the only thing preventing a great power war is the engagement of the United States globally, holding the whole thing together. And that if Trump, with an America First type policy, retrenches on that, even though as much as he might desire a Nobel Peace Prize, and I agree with that 100%, like he very much wants one. That's why in his first term, he was making all the overtures to North Korea and so forth. He wanted that prize. He would actually engage in policies that would make a great power war more likely to happen. Having said that, where you would go to the symptom argument is, and this is something that I've argued in other places, that we're not in a world war, but we are in a world at war. The amount of conflict happening in the world over the past few years is, according to data from UCDP, Uppsala Conflict Data Project, and other sources, have shown that we're actually witnessing more conflict in the world now than any year since World War II. And none of these are great power wars. And so because of that, we say, oh, we're still in this time of peace. But there are a lot of wars happening in the world. And the question is, why is that? One thing that's notable is that has been something Trump himself has picked up on. I thought it was notable, his victory speech on the night of the election. The first thing he said was, we got all these wars happening in the world. We got to bring them to an end. You know, he felt like he could do that. And he even mentioned that again during his inauguration. He said, I'm going to be a peacemaker, and we're going to go around and solve all these. Again, I think he wants that Nobel Prize. But the question is, can he actually do that? Because maybe he is more a symptom of the factor that's leading to more of this, which is a return to multipolarity. A return to a world where the U.S. is simply not in a position to be able to go around and keep the peace, if you will. And instead, we're in a position where competition with China, a resurgent Russia, and that is a recipe for both competition between those great powers, which raises prospect of war, but also a great phrase I heard someone else use, great power competition leads to great power distraction. That they're so distracted with each other, they're not taking time to, before in the 90s, we would have gone and helped broker a ceasefire here before that conflict breaks out. Now we're too distracted to actually do that. And the question is Trump, the rise of Trump and the kind of sentiments that lead to Trump being elected are more a reflection of the U.S.'s declining power as we're entering a multipolar world, which is really the cause then of all these conflicts. So that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about this, is that we could be on the verge of a great power war. We could talk about specifics of could Ukraine escalate or Taiwan or so forth. But in terms of overall, that's the way that I've been thinking about this, is that Trump may in very many ways simply be a symptom of this factor.
So let me ask then on that question, I think, a high school textbook version of World War II looks like the mistake of the Allied powers was early appeasement. That whether you want to talk about Czechoslovakia or you want to talk about France not standing up when Germany went into Poland, and that the French could have crushed, at least according to the Germans, that the French could have crushed the Germans on the spot and it all would have been over, and that the mistake was a kind of wait and see attitude. They're like, the Germans, Poland and maybe let's wait, and we don't want to piss them off too much, and maybe it'll all work out okay. And we waited too long, and then the costs were way higher when all was said and done. So I guess I have two-part question here as we think about Trump and multipolarity and great power conflict. Is that lesson that we were all taught to take from history, that like the wait and see was the mistake, that kind of appeasement, kind of restrained approach was the mistake, or is that a contingent fact of World War II? And is Trump an appeaser? Should we expect that if Putin pushes a little farther? Should we expect if Xi pushes a little further? Should we expect Trump, because of the retrenchment, to say that's a long way from here, or is he more belligerent than we think?
I actually thought that when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and what happened, this sort of confirmed what was in this history textbooks, that basically appeasement was a problem because Ukraine was helped in the ways Czechoslovakia was not helped, Poland was not helped. Ukraine was helped much less than Ukrainians could have expected, and certainly they bear the brunt of this war, but they got far more help than any small European country got in the run-up to the active phase of the World War II. So basically, I think that it's very fair to compare Putin with Hitler, but Putin was stopped earlier at a great cost for Ukraine and at some cost for Europe, and for Europe and the United States. But this is sort of a lesson learned, and I think that the second Trump administration, this lesson is internalized. So Trump now, I think whatever he thinks about the cult of power, he thinks of Putin as an acute danger. So he basically understands who Putin is, and that there is no like partial appeasement, that it never stopped. It would never stop.
I mean, to this point, I think if we are going back to this idea that Trump always does the last thing he heard in the room, Zelensky has done a great job of always making sure he's the last person in the room, right? He has done a great job of constantly appealing to Trump in this regard. I remember on election night, he was the first world leader to congratulate him, immediately used that phrase of peace through strength, being able to continue to say, look, you're the one who's strong enough to stand up to Putin. And I think that they've absolutely been playing to that, to where Trump won't be an appeaser in that way. And I actually think that's an excellent point about that, the lesson that we've learned from Ukraine. In some respects, you could say that there was a lesson learned from World War II. If you want to say January of 2022 was the equivalent of August 1939, to where there's all these rumblings, things are going to happen. February of 2022 is the equivalent of September 1939. But the difference is this time, instead of the small state being invaded and the Allied powers saying, oh, we can't do anything to stop it, this time, because of Zelensky, they said, we're going to supply ammo. And we're actually, and then due to the efforts of the Ukrainian people, actually stopping the aggressive power. So in that sense, you could say there maybe was a lesson that it's not so much the deal there, but once an invasion starts, you have to come in and actually take action. And because of my point about Zelensky and seeing other world leaders doing that, I think Trump would do that. I think if Taiwan was invaded, I think there would be an appeal to Trump's ego to be like, you got to help us. You're strong enough to stand up to Xi. You don't want to look weak, right? They'll appeal to that. So I think those actions would be taken.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this broad lesson about the role of appeasement in World War II is a crucial one. If you think about what, the counterfactual world where Trump wins in 2020, and he's in the office and you just replay everything, and January 22 happens all over again, what's going to happen? Right? You will not see the same level of international support, let alone the same level of support from the United States. Russia sweeps through, right? And I think that that's because, again, there would have been sort of a posturing of appeasement, right? A posturing of let's just wait and see, let us come to a settlement. Now, if you think about the position that's been taken very recently by Trump on how to handle Ukraine, and how to think about aid transfers, it is very much that the US needs to back off of the aid transfers and Europe needs to step up about its own security. Because the United States, according to this, does not stand to benefit nearly as much from a Ukraine held by Ukraine as Europe does. And therefore, Europe needs to be the one that's bearing the brunt of this. And I think that you're hearing that sort of same like America First language all over again of we need to think about this as a transaction. Who benefits from this transaction the most? It is not the United States. It's those allies that are closest to the front. They should be the ones actually paying for it.
So
I think
can we talk about that and Taiwan then? Because I think Taiwan poses an interesting question for that kind of analysis in a few different ways. One is, so we're only a few years from China's military being at the point where it is instructed to be ready to invade and take Taiwan. Our allies in the region do not have the kind of balancing strength that our allies in Europe potentially do, right? Japan is demilitarized. Australia does not have cannot muster the kind of military strength to balance China that you might think that France and Germany and might be able to balance Russia. So there's this claim about like the appeal to the ego, and you're strong enough to stand up to China to defend Taiwan. And I think there's two questions there. One is there might be that appeal to are we in fact strong enough to stand up to China on Taiwan? I would say our military readiness today, the answer is probably no, but are we mobilizable to be, or is it not just words? Have policy decisions been made, in fact, well before Trump, such that whatever it is we say, we have shown if there's an amphibious assault, we are not there for it. We are not capable of and don't intend. I don't know. Like, have we already given up on deterrence in some sense, or is that not the right analysis? And we could scale up. And would Trump, are our allies capable of scaling up? Yeah.
I mean, I would say the U.S. has made a bit of a down payment on this with its agreement with Australia and the United Kingdom about developing some of those naval capabilities. Is that alone going to be enough? No. Right, that protects just one of the fronts of this like very large potential like military operation. Same thing with Japan, right? They fall under the American military umbrella for a reason, right? And they certainly would not have the capability to do that. So when we think about this, Ethan, you mentioned earlier the choices that have been made about investments, long-run investments in the buildup of military capabilities. We failed to anticipate the need to have a significant set of naval assets in that region in the long run that is keeping pace with the innovations militarily that are occurring. And when we think about the fact that like a lot of the acquisitions that have been made by, for example, just to hear China, many of their port acquisitions, to go back to that earlier, are occurring in and around areas that enable China to engage in open surveillance of those operations that are being developed with the United Kingdom and Australia, right? That's been done intentionally. And you can imagine that like in that setting, even if there is some potential balance in that region, there's just not enough for the entire theater of potential conflict. I will say that the only thing that potentially balances against this is that there has been this announcement of roughly $500 billion fund set up in collaboration with private industry to support developing bleeding edge artificial intelligence technologies, including military technologies. And so if we think that maybe the future of conflict is less the sort of standard large scale naval activity and instead is something like AI-driven unmanned aerial vehicles, maybe that investment will pay off. But we likely won't see the payoff of that in the...
Is that an argument for Pete Hegseth, putting character aside? If you want to force the Navy to stop building big boats, even though they love building big boats, do you need an outsider Secretary of Defense?
I think one of the arguments is along these lines is another reason why I think that the Trump administration would not abandon Taiwan is, to this point, Hegseth, all of the main appointees that he has made on the foreign policy front are all, if there's one unifying theme, they're China hawks. They are China hawks. They are not people who are going to sit there and say, oh yeah, we should just let China do this. We should let them control the first island chain or second island chain. They are all China hawks. So that's kind of one piece of evidence that makes me say that he is not just going to give up on Taiwan or any type of aggressive action by China. The second thing, though, is they're all also unified. And somebody else in this regard, I think he's now in a deputy defense position. He was in the first administration, it's Elbridge Colby. And he is someone who is not just a China hawk, but he has made a lot of overtures about the need for investment precisely because we need to have the military capability to stand up to China. He has argued a lot about the reason why we need the Europeans to take on more in Europe is because we need to redirect those resources to East Asia for the purposes of China. And I think he's going to be also in a prominent defense policy position in the Trump administration. So I don't expect Trump to abandon Taiwan. I think the people he's selecting would not want to do so. But I also think the people he's selecting recognize that if China were to try to make a play tomorrow, setting aside the difficulty of an amphibious assault, this is, so people have been trying to say, well, what is China learning from Ukraine? And it's like, well, they're probably learning one thing: a land war is very different than amphibious assault. It's a very different operation. But setting that aside, we may not necessarily be in a position to respond tomorrow, but will we be in a position to respond by 2027, which I think is the actual deadline you're referring to? That, I think, is one of the goals that members of his foreign policy team actually have.
I mean, do you think that we can do that by January 1st, 2027? I mean, to Ethan's point, right? We're talking about a massive military buildup to have at least the kinetic capability to respond in that theater. Can that happen in 2 years?
I think one thing that needs to happen is, and one thing that could happen is, you're right, being able to build up major platforms, probably not going to happen. I mean, how long ago did, we were talking about AUKUS, how long ago did they get signed? They're still trying to work out getting these things built. But can we ramp up munitions? That's one big area of shortage that came up that was almost embarrassing from a standpoint, is we don't have enough munitions to give to Ukraine. And whether you agree with giving them to Israel or not, they just simply were in a situation where we don't have enough to actually give Ukraine what they want and give what Israel is asking for. We actually have to choose between them because we don't have enough of that production. That's one area of production I think they could ramp up very quickly. But to your point, a lot of the major platforms, they wouldn't be able to ramp up quickly.
So that points us towards our third front on our three-front war, which is, of course, Mars. No, that's not right.
We did start the Space Force.
Which is the Middle East. We have not talked about the Middle East. I think we got to talk about the Middle East a little bit. There's a lot, obviously, going on in the Middle East. I think rather than focusing in on although it's related to the Nobel Peace Prize, I guess, focusing in specifically on the war in Gaza and Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, I think if we think about the broader Middle Eastern context, there's a lot interesting to think about, because I think if you think about the Trump administration, I suspect human rights aren't going to be high on so I think we should be thinking more realpolitik if we're going to think about Trump administration policy towards the Middle East. And here I think you see interesting trends that going on, which relate to some of the agenda from the first Trump administration, which is a kind of reorientation of the Middle East that pits Iran and its circle of influence, I guess, against alliance is too strong a word, but a growing détente and implicit alliance between the Saudis, the Gulf states, and Israel, which have both, I think, pretty profound economic interests in building an economy in the Middle East, as well as, at this point, a shared interest in fighting against a set of ideological and political adversaries that they share. And so I think we're seeing some interesting realignment. It feels to me like that Trump will want to continue to push on that. Is that right? Will he be effective? And what will that mean for stability in the Middle East?
I don't know. I might be a sort of a dissident among foreign affairs experts, because I'm not sure that the United States is a major player in the Middle East conflict, in the sense that I think American presidents, American government tries to do a lot of things, but there are just far more important forces on the ground there, and they play a far larger role than anything. So, there is a tradition to sort of overestimate American influence. It's sort of exacerbated by the fact that all sides around the world, all governments, they blame America on whatever happens, which increases this illusion of American power. But looking like we probably the Trump administration would put more emphasis on helping like Israel and perhaps right-wing parties in Israel pay less attention to the humanitarian issues in Gaza. But look back at the current Hamas versus Israel agreement. The experts even cannot get whether this was Biden administration negotiating the deal or Trump administration negotiating the deal. So those people, my friends in Israel who believed in Trump magic, they're sort of extremely disappointed. But those people who for years seen people disappointed in Trump, those who believed in Trump magic, that it's not surprising. So I just questioning whether America is really the big player there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think that, Paul, you mentioned this earlier, right? Trump calling out that this is a world at war, even if it's not a world war, right? Mm-hmm. I think that a tremendous amount of human suffering happening on the planet right now is associated with one military that has used its proxy forces globally, and that's Iran, right? And I think that the Trump administration is taking very seriously the threat that poses, as is Israel. And you've seen that in the military strikes that they've tried to achieve. And the Trump administration will now couple the military might of Israel with the economic force of maximum pressure sanctions 2.0, right? And this has already been announced and will almost certainly go and become policy. And the aim there is to cripple Iran, to keep them from being able to invest in their proxy forces, to keep them from continuously destabilizing Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and with the aim of hopefully stabilizing those conflicts and enabling peace. Now, this isn't to say that the U.S. is the only actor that has the power to do that, but certainly they have an outsized role in achieving at least that one particular policy aim. And when we think about this relationship between Saudi, the sort of budding relationship between Saudi and Israel, you have to think about that in the context of the region as a whole, right? So the fate of the region will be tied to something called Vision 2030, which is the largest public investment program since the New Deal. And if you think about it in per capita terms, far outstrips the New Deal in terms of the intensity of the investment. That's happening in Saudi. That's happening largely both through public financing from Saudi, but also financing from abroad, including financing from Israel. And so when we think about what kinds of factors precipitate major political events, one thing that likely led to the events that occurred in Israel in October is in fact the warming of relations between Israel and Saudi. The fact that on the table was official normalization. And in the end, with Saudi goes the rest of the GCC, the rest of the region. And I think that would potentially enable sort of a future of prosperity in the region, hopefully with minimal disruption. Now, of course, Iran wants to play the role of the spoiler, and that's exactly what happened in that scenario. And again, falls back to the United States would like to take a firm position against them being and all capable of playing the role of the spoiler. So, I don't think that this necessarily wins Trump the Nobel Prize for Peace, but in some sense, if the maximum pressure campaign 2.0 achieves the goal of crippling their ability to fund proxies, then indeed maybe it will facilitate a normalization of relations and maybe some stability and prosperity in the broader region.
And one way that I could, kind of pull these two things together is, for me, one way in which, or I guess I would say, if there's a signature foreign policy accomplishment of the first Trump administration, one that he actually received a lot of credit for, and that the Biden administration continued, it was the Abraham Accords. That was something that, and when you look at those accords, that's of course in reference to these various agreements seeking to normalize relations between Israel and various countries in that region. And the unifying theme around those accords is that it is a way of kind of creating, maybe not an alliance, but a balancing coalition against Iran. That's been the unifying thing with that. And I do think that this played a role in October 2023. I think that, Hamas's own, at the time, second in command. He made more of a reference, this was in April of 2023, about the distraction I was talking about. He was saying the world is primed right now for action because of the fact that both the U.S. is distracted with Ukraine, other places are distracted. I do think Iran kind of played a role in kind of saying, hey, everybody's distracted. No one's going to come to Israel's help with this. You can take this action. So I do think that that is one thing that has been a signature accomplishment of Trump. I think that's a key reason that he also wanted to go to your point about who is responsible for the ceasefire agreement. I think, at the end of the day, the agreement that was signed was indeed similar to the one that Biden had proposed. But I think the time pressure that the Trump administration put on, which is both, I think they didn't want to have to deal with this when they came into office. And I think also they want to continue to extend the Abraham Accords. They were like, we want to be able to get an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We want that to be the signature accomplishment. We want Trump to get a Nobel Peace Prize for that. And if this war is still going on, that's not going to happen. So I do think in that way, it kind of brings these things together, is to say that that's where you can see Trump. He wants to see these Abraham Accords continue to balance against Iran. And that was a big reason why I think he did have an interest in seeing the ceasefire agreement be reached, and hence members of his campaign or his now administration putting pressure to be able to get a deal done.
So I think it'd be interesting to talk about but I'm going to, about that further pushing in whether the Saudis will insist on anything more than cosmetic for the Palestinians in such an expansion of those agreements. But I think we'll maybe leave that for another time, although I think it's a fascinating question, because I do want to, before we open it up, talk a little bit about the international organizations and the crumbling rules-based order. And if I was a member of the Trump administration, I think, and I was talking about the withdrawal from the WHO or the Paris Climate Accords, and I think probably other withdrawals from some of the institutions of the rules-based order that we're going to see over the next few weeks. And if I was to talk about maybe the pressure campaign on NATO allies and other allies, I would say something like, look, we should be honest with ourselves. And lots of facts about the rules-based order seemed like good ideas in the aftermath of World War II, and maybe they were good ideas, but they have over time become ineffectual and corrupted. That the WHO, for all you can say, viruses don't respect boundaries, so we got to have the WHO. The WHO is a corrupted organization that is in the thrall of adversaries of America. And that the Paris Climate Accords are a bunch of promises that nobody is keeping, in which we lie to ourselves about what the future of the globe looks like. And that NATO, prior to Trump, was the United States paying for the security of Europe and everybody else free riding on it. And that honesty in these things is better than lip service to nice ideas that don't work. So I think that's the argument. Is that fair, unfair? What's going to be the consequence of withdrawing from some of these things?
I would say that I would make a distinction between NATO and WHO. I think with NATO, it basically was initially that United States pays for never being involved, not to, again, send 2 million troops and lost 400,000 people as in a foreign war. So it was an idea that the United States pays for not going there. So when Donald Trump says that other countries should pay for protection, I mean, the United States pay not to send troops to Europe as they were forced in 1942, so in 1943. So that's one thing. I think with international organizations, the thing is that a lot of international organizations, they were sort of organized by international organizations, but they were financed and led by the United States. So I am not surprised that United States withdrew from WHO, in which it financed more than half of all the expenditures, and historically even more than that. And then it appears that actually other countries control this. It's even worse with organizations like World Bank or International Monetary Fund, which are not, I mean, the United States cannot cut funds of the World Bank because it's financed by the endowment given by the United States. But think of the World Bank. The World Bank, it's an international organization that should help development. There is only one country in the world with some other universities around that are interested in other countries' development. There are no Chinese scholars who would be writing about developing other countries. There are no Russian scholars who would work on developing other countries. So the World Bank or International Monetary Fund, they exist because the United States are interested in these causes. All other countries think about this as something like as prizes that they could have power in. And when they got power, like China gets power in the World Bank, but they're not interested in developing other countries. Like, look at the scholarship. There is no scholarship coming from China on the world development. So this organization stopped working. So it's not surprising that at some point the United States withdraws.
I mean, I would just say, I don't know, I'm not sure that I would say that China is disinterested in international development. I mean, they've invested many billions of dollars in trying to expand their reach.
Do Chinese scholars write papers about malaria in Bangladesh or what happens in Africa? No.
I think no. I mean, it may be the case that the Chinese Academy is disinterested in this, but I can tell you the Chinese state is not. Right,
no,
so they have invested tremendously in
say
the
these
road
words,
initiative.
But they're not actually.
No, of course. There's a tremendous presence of Chinese development funds.
Like buying ports.
Buying ports is just one example, right?
But it's
there
not
are
a development.
many different layers of this. No, I mean, of course, it is at the end of the day, right, doing the exact same thing that the World Bank is trying to achieve, right? It's trying to extend the U.S. influence through the use of resources that are based off of frequently lending
like cargo cult. They consider World Bank as if it was something that extends the United States influence. But if you look at the academic work, it was used, but only on the margins. It's actually aimed to reduce poverty, to bring clean water, to improve these causes. And other countries think that this is just like another way of extending soft power.
Exactly. I think that's precisely how most states see it, right? Is this is not hard power. When you invest in development, you're investing in soft power. You're thinking about politics of a particular means, right? And it's not just the United States that invested in this, right? In the World Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative and dozens of other initiatives launched by China are trying to achieve the exact same aims, is to extend that soft power reach. And I think that. But behind much of what I think you said, Kostya, is absolutely right, which is if you think about some of the claims that are being made by the Trump administration, as unfortunate as it is for us to admit, often there is an element of truth to the assertion that is actually made. So when we think about the World Health Organization and the outsized investment the United States makes in this, one has to question whether or not the United States actually receives an equivalent benefit relative to our investment, and the answer is no. Right, and when we think about that, right, so there is an element of truth to this. Does it mean that we should actually withdraw? No, of course not, right? The World Health Organization, there's significant value add there. The question is there a way for us to actually equalize the investment made by all in the benefit that all receive from an institution like the WHO? All right, and I think the same thing can be said of the Paris Accords. What is the primary justification of withdrawing from the Paris Accords? The primary justification under the Trump administration as part of this executive order is concerns about American workers and the impact of the Accords on American economic development. Right? Well, if there were ways of adjusting the Accords accordingly, then there might be a way of maintaining the rules-based order. But I mean, I think that this is 2.0, right? So the Trump 1 withdrew from the Paris Accords. Now they're going to withdraw again from the Paris Accords. It's not as if the global climate crisis has gone away. It's not as if global cooperation in one form or another has gone away during that period of time. This is just going to be cooperation of a different means, would be my guess.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I think about Trump and international institutions, if you go back to that 19th century idea, obviously the U.S. wasn't part of a lot of these international institutions. I mean, there were some that the U.S. was part of, the postal union and things of that nature, which I think during the first one, didn't he try to withdraw the U.S. from that? I think, those are another ones. But I think that from his standpoint, it's like, why do we need to be part of these, especially given, number one, we weren't part of these when the U.S. was great. When he says great again, what is he referring to? 19th century. He's saying we weren't part of that then. And moreover, he is very much of like, and we don't need to be part of it because American power, if we're great, we can go around and solve these problems without having to work through these institutions, right? That's why he's not looking at like retrenching the size of the US military, right? But I also think that's why there are certain institutions that do appeal to him. Like I said, he's not turning away from the Abraham Accords. He's like, no, that's a form of institution, treaty that works for him. Peace agreements work for him. And you know what? NATO does too. Especially because that was one of the things last time they said Stoltenberg, the Secretary General at the time, should have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize for the way he worked Trump. Because he gave Trump all the credit for NATO countries spending more on defense. Said, oh, because of Trump's great leadership, they're now spending more. Of course, it wasn't. They had agreed to start spending more during Obama's administration, but he gave all the credit to Trump. By the end of Trump's last term, he was saying, I'm a NATO fan because I fixed NATO. Right? And NATO can also work because the military likes NATO. So it's like, okay, NATO's fine, but it just needs to do things better, right? So he's not going to withdraw from NATO, but there's these other ones where he's like, why are we part of this? I don't get it. This isn't something that fits in my 19th century mold of thinking about the world, right?
So I think we're going to open up for questions. I'll warn you, you can ask about uncontroversial topics like the Middle East, but if you ask about the World Bank, I can't promise what's going to happen. Conflict could break out at any moment. So,
thank you so much for this very informative discussion. And my question has to do with the end of the war in Ukraine. As we know, President Trump has promised that he can do it in 24 hours.
I think he missed that deadline.
Yeah. It seems like only one person in the world, President Putin, can in fact end it in 24 hours by withdrawing the troops. And the fact that President Trump was conflating that was strange to my point, to my mind. What kind of misidentification maybe with President Putin. So anyway, I wanted to ask about the transactional nature of how this end to the war would come about. What would motivate President Putin to actually end it? Would those be the economic factors, the state of the Russian economy? Would it be the recognition of President Putin and invitation him back to the big boys clubs that President Trump could credibly provide? How would this transactional nature come about? There are some great signals coming like from the Davos Forum, from both, for some reason, both the president of Finland and the foreign minister have said that we are sure that this war is going to be ending soon, like in 3 months. But I wonder what would be the steps from your point? How would Putin actually be persuaded to end it?
You want to start with this?
Okay. Historically, we Russians withdraw our troops from other countries when our state collapses. That's how we end the war. So that happened during World War I. Actually, not only to Russia. Like if you remember the history of World War I, it ended with a huge defeat of Germany, but there was no single foreign soldier on German territory. So like Germany was basically winning on all the battlefields, but the state has collapsed and it lost the war. Then the Soviet Union withdrawn its troops from the Eastern Europe in 1990, 1991. Basically, it was a part of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm I hope against hope that there are ways to persuade Putin, but I actually think that he will run, if his health permits, he will run Russia to a state collapse, not to Russia's non-existence, but actually the collapse of the current state. I think that Trump sort of understands this. I think that initially he thought about Putin as more transactional than Putin is, because Putin looks sort of strategic and transactional, but he is actually stupid and ideological. So he will probably keep running down.
I have nothing to add to that. I think it was great.
Hello, thank you for this brilliant talk. I just wanted to ask about the Palestinian question, and if you see the U.S., do you foresee the U.S. participating in that beyond just cementing its relationship with Israel? I know you talked about the 2020 Abraham Accords. I just want to know if you foresee the U.S. actively participating, or just playing its role in settling that, establishing a two-state solution, like establishing a Palestinian nation. Like, how do you foresee the U.S. solving this problem?
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, I will say that if so I'm not sure how many of you all watched the inauguration or watched the signing of the executive orders, but Trump was asked this exact question, right? And his response is that he has no interest, right, in the U.S. participating. He's like, this is their conflict. They're going to resolve this, at least the current iteration of the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And I think that if you kind of take a step back and think about the sort of very transactional nature of this, right? Going back to the Abraham Accords, why is that so important? Because they would like to facilitate unleashing all of the economic potential of the region, right? And that only occurs if there's some form of resolution, but it's not obvious that would necessarily be a favorable outcome for the Palestinian people, right? And so, I mean, I think that's the thing that we have to take very seriously, is that although there may have been efforts under the Biden administration to try and carve out an agreement that would be beneficial for all, that might not necessarily be the case under this administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with your position, except, as I said, what I opened with, Trump is predictably unpredictable. And so can I envision a scenario where suddenly he's like, you know what, let's solve this thing? I could see it where if he becomes so enamored with the idea of wanting to expand the Abraham Accords because he thinks it's going to get him a Nobel Peace Prize, and Saudi Arabia comes in and says, you know what, we're not going to sign on until we come up with some sort of solution regarding Palestine, then I think he might sit there and go, you know what, okay, we got to get this solved. Let's do this. And then I think he then starts to become someone who's like, I see this solved. He may not be Bill Clinton, Camp David, I'm there trying to negotiate it, but instead be more of like, I want my envoy there putting pressure for them to try to figure this out. I could see that scenario. I do think, though, it's again, like, will he actively do that? Short of that, I don't think so. But I think if he was in that type of scenario, I could see him suddenly taking an active role in it.
I'm just going to add one thing, which is I think that this scenario is actually almost certain to happen. That is that the Saudis and the Israelis want to move closer together. They have a million reasons to want to move closer together. The Saudis are delighted in lots of ways with Israel's prosecution of the war, which has achieved lots of Saudi Arabia's foreign policy goals for them. And I think it is true that the Saudis will face some domestic constraints to insist on something to do with Palestinian sovereignty, but I would bet almost anything that they will say that, and what they will insist on and get is window dressing. And there will be something. You'll be able to have a press release and an event, but it'll be window dressing. And where we will land is the Israelis and Saudis closer together. And in a lot of ways, the status quo ante. That is to say, more or less the situation on the West Bank as it has been since Sharon was prime minister of Israel, and Gaza, more to the extent that it's governed at all, governed by Hamas and massively constrained, and Israel adopting a policy of deter and disable. And you'll get some little window dressing about autonomy, about demilitarized autonomy, whatever. They'll say some things, they'll write some things, nothing really will change.
Trump will take credit for it.
Trump will take credit for that, as will the Saudis, and that will be sufficient for Saudi domestic political constraints. But I don't think I think the Saudis only really care because of their domestic political constraints, not because they...
Inherently.
Yeah, I think they would trade off essentially nothing about economic integration of the region and closer ties to Israel. I think that's the real that's my guess about the real politic of the thing.
I'm going to add one thing real quick, which is, if you go back and watch this clip, one thing that Trump talks about is that Gaza is a phenomenal location, right? And so, when we think about this, like what's underneath all of what you heard us say is that a very transactional approach. How do we extract as much value out of a potential settlement as possible? And as that comment suggests, he was very much interested in the fact that Gaza sees sun year-round, that it's right off of the ocean, and it's a perfect place for him to develop a Trump Tower.
Yeah.
Right. And
There's
so,
like
Hotel.
twin towers in Tel Aviv and
Yeah.
twin Trump towers
Yep.
in Tel Aviv and in Gaza. Yeah.
Yeah. That was his comment to North
Yeah.
Korea,
Yeah.
right? Oh, look at those beautiful beaches. Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't hold my breath.
So thank you all for this very inspiring conversation. So I heard you mention about the balancing the equity from investment overseas and benefits received by the US. So my question is that will the balancing like potentially affect global trading policies proposed by the Trump government? And if so, that how will that happen?
We haven't talked much about trade
Yeah.
on this.
We ran out of time. It was on the list.
It was on the list.
well, I mean, you see it with TikTok, right? So the demand for like a 50% ownership
Yeah.
in TikTok, I mean, it's just like a small like example of this happening, right? So the ban occurs, a threat occurs, he sort of backs away from the threat, he makes an outrageous request, and we'll see ultimately what happens. At the same time, right, it's, I think the number is 10% tariff on Chinese goods, right? During the same press conference, we were talking about a phenomenal location. He said maybe we'll boost it to 100%.
Yeah.
Right. What is on the table with Mexico and Canada at this point, I think, is 25%. And again, like where do these numbers come from? These numbers are threats, right? And so ultimately, the question is whether or not there's something in exchange short of the threat itself becoming real.
Are those threats credible? Like so, on the domestic policy panel last week, Ryan Kellogg pointed out that essentially all of the gasoline that we consume in the upper Midwest comes from Canada, and that the price of gas would kind of double for the speed with which we could build refinery infrastructure and moving it around infrastructure is so slow that through the entire Trump presidency, the upper Midwest would see a doubling of gas prices
In response to what?
to the tariffs on Canada.
Tariffs of what size? How?
The threatened.
No, if
20%.
it's 10%.
Yeah.
Double.
Something like that essentially it becomes impossible to. I don't remember Brian's exact numbers, but it was an unimaginable effect on the economy of the upper Midwest, which just seems absurd on its face that no precedent has. Should we take these things as credible at all?
Well, I think a good lesson for me on this is go back to somebody who didn't seem quite as enamored by tariffs, but did it, and that was George W. Bush, right? With
I thought
his
you were going to say McKinley.
Well, McKinley, yeah, that's right. I was going to go back. I'm going to go back. I'm not saying Trump, but when George W. Bush imposed steel tariffs, and he did it in order to protect certain U.S. steel producers, and he was saying, well, we're going to be doing, and then they started getting a lot of blowback for that for two reasons. Number one, you had steel consumers who were upset about that. Number two, the EU then started threatening targeted sanctions on, say, oranges in Florida, which at the time, Florida was real important politically to Bush because of what happened in 2000. And suddenly it was like, oh, you know what? Maybe we're not going to do this. But of course, he waited until the WTO came out and said that the U.S. is in compliance. And then that gave him a way of saying, well, we're going to go along with what the WTO says. Yeah, sure. But, they've already accomplished their goal. So that was Bush. And he wasn't quite as ideologically enamored with tariffs as Trump. But I could see very much a similar thing as you're pointing to, which is he may very well want to go through with some tariffs. I do agree that it's largely a bargaining thing. He's not going to impose 100. He'll impose 10%, but then there'll be the blowback, and he'll spin some story like Bush did about why, okay, now everything's fine and we can kind of get rid of these tariffs. And I think that's a similar thing he'll ultimately do.
I mean, I would say, if you're worried about how credible is the commitment to the threat, right? Think about like the trade war with China during Trump 1.
Yeah.
There were massive negative economic effects of his commitments to those tariffs, and yet the tariffs went through. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers that Ryan was talking about, but I think that the likelihood of Mexico, Canada seeing a 25% tariff is a little bit absurd, but I do think the 10% tariff on China is like a much more likely outcome. Mm-hmm. And, if anything, right, like if we think about this the TikTok playing with the TikTok ban, I think is another example of the fact that like that could have been very disruptive. It was in fact quite disruptive for a short period of time, and then use that as a wedge.
And I think the other reason why the China ones are more credible is that issue is overladen with other factors, right? It's overladen with great power competition, rivalry, so forth. Whereas these other tariffs, like my example of the Bush tariffs, those were imposed on largely U.S. allies.
Yeah.
It was much more like the threats to Canada and Mexico, and then eventually like, okay, we'll back off. But the China one, I agree, there's more to it. It's not purely just a economic.
When you add in these national security and supply chain.
Okay,
Exactly.
I actually sort of contrarian on this. I think that I'm pretty sure that I read Paul Krugman and Jason Furman, who are like more democratically inclined, who would say that actually these tariffs, 10%, 20%, this will be a wash for American economy. So it's no question that there is a negative impact, but it will not be hugely negative. So there is a lot of leeway in the sense that it will not affect Republican Party prospects immediately. It will actually not affect inflation in the ways people say. It will be 10%, the maximum 10% increase in prices, which will be spread over several years. So unfortunately, the United States is basically the only country in the world which could afford isolationism in a big way. And I think this means that Trump could have his 10% tariffs, even across the board.
Right, so I think there's one last question over here. All the microphones are converging.
Hi. So thank you for your insights, and some of the points you brought up kind of informed this question. My question goes to a basic, is the U.S. foreign policy, in your opinion, in the upcoming administration going to be coherent? And I ask that question you bring up Camp David. I think back to September 2019, negotiating with the Taliban at Camp David, and then Trump going to Twitter and saying we're going to be out of Afghanistan by December. And I think the one thing we see in Trump is he will not lose face. And actually walking back from that, I'm surprised we didn't leave in December. I was under the headquarters at the time that was planning that, and that was news, to say the least. And then we agreed to a May withdrawal with the Taliban. That ended up being August, and we saw how that went. It goes to credibility when I think of coherence as well. Trade wars with a military intelligence partner like Canada in Five Eyes, and how Five Eyes contains China. And the implications of that, and leaving Afghanistan, if you're trying to curtail Iran's influence, and leaving the Iranian nuclear deal, you have two bases on either side of Iran, in Afghanistan and Iraq with U.S. presence, and then you leave one. Do we have a coherent foreign policy plan when we go to look at containing threats? And is it credible, or, we're doing a strategic crisis negotiation exercise this weekend with the Army War College, and I'm wondering if I can just tell the U.S. delegation whatever they want to tell the president, and then go about my business negotiating a diplomatic outcome in my interests.
The initial response I would have is, do we ever have a coherent foreign policy under any administration, right? A good example I think of here is U.S. policy towards Syria, right? Where that was a situation where the Obama administration is trying to support the Kurds against Assad's regime, but that's upsetting a U.S. ally, Turkey, that of course is very concerning. And then how do you balance that? But they weren't really trying to think of the full game. They're just like, we got to support them because otherwise Assad here and Russia's stepping in. So it can lead to these contradictions that eventually, as it turned out, the Trump administration very much brought to the fore when, of course, they abandoned the Kurds, and Trump ended up receiving a lot of criticism. Probably the best criticism he received in his presidency was his decision to abandon the Kurds. Even some of his staunchest supporters in the Senate criticized him for it. But that's an example of where that was a policy that was already contradictory under Obama, and then Trump inherited that. So I think a lot of times with foreign policy, it's very difficult to have a strictly coherent foreign policy. You go back to the Cold War, you can see times where the U.S. is taking very belligerent policies towards economic policies, towards allies that are key, towards countries that are key security allies. And the two things don't quite go together, except for maybe you just say that the U.S. was being a bully at that time. That might be the one unifying theory that I would have, if I may, which is that if there's one thing that maybe is coherent, is that even under other administrations, the U.S. can be kind of an asshole when it comes to foreign policy, which is we're in a position to be able to do something and we're going to do it and maybe not even think about how does this impact other things. Right.
Yeah, that's what I would probably say as well. Like it's of course it's common to call Donald Trump's policy America first, but I'm not sure that I agree with the criticism that Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, they actually negotiated so that America would not be first. I think they also tried to make deals as tough as possible and always did what was in America's, what they thought was in the America's best interest. And like what I'm leading to is that a lot of problems around the world, they're not solvable with all the American might and power. I actually think about this, about the Middle East, and I'm even about Russia and Ukraine. It's not clear that the United States could do much of this. I mean, Russia and Ukraine had their problems long before the United States came to existence. So it's not clear that the United States is that mighty player. So I think President Trump would be coherent in his pursuit of the Nobel Peace Prize. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only thing that will likely occur is that no matter what the outcome is of any decision, someone will be saying, we did this because we were putting America first.
Yeah.
Right. So that's probably the only coherent thing that ties everything together is the framing of the justification for the choice that was made. Even if the choices actually don't hold together at all, they're completely incoherent. And maybe a slightly different way of thinking about this, because you brought up the Afghan case, and this is a case that's like near and dear to me personally, is not just thinking about whether or not you have a coherent grand strategy, right? So whether or not all of your foreign policy holds together, but even whether or not you have internal consistency in the way that you fight even one particular conflict, right? And I think that that's an excellent example of one where you didn't even have internal consistency in the approach. You had a number of individuals who were abandoned, who thought that the United States would be able to stand for them and with them and take care of them in the event that, say, the final phases of the withdrawal ended up occurring. And I think that likely what you will see is also the lack of internal consistency as well, right? And I think that that's just, that may be true of probably every administration. They have different ways of fighting wars. I mean, to the Obama example in Syria, right? The Obama administration had a red line, right, about the use of chemical weapons, and then just allowed the red line to be violated.
They abandoned Islamists in this case. It's Trump who abandoned Kurds, but before that, Obama abandoned anti-Assad Islamists.
Yes, and so what you're saying is that look, like one probably shouldn't cast stones when you live in a glass house, right? And this isn't just a problem of one administration or another. This lack of internal consistency is a problem in almost every single way that a president fights a war, right? And it could be explained by sort of dynamic changes on the ground, changes in like the preferences of the public that voted for them, the upcoming election, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the key thing, the one consistency we will see, is that no matter what the outcome, no matter what the policy, someone will be proclaiming that it put America first.
And that brings it back nicely to your first question. When you ask, is there a Trump doctrine? We could even ask, is there ever really a doctrine, right? Or, in light of this.
I'm going to say Henry Kissinger had a doctrine. But before we turn to Libya or whether the United States ever learns any lessons, let me wrap us up and say thank you to our three panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.